Okay, ladies and gentlemen, let's cool down a little bit. Get in position. All right, we're going to start with DJ Spooky. I just want to say one thing very quickly. I'm very impressed by the conference so far, of course, but what's really impressive is the fact that we have DJ Spooky here. And if you look on the screen, this is an application he designed and built. It is free. It does an amazing amount of things. You can see right here, I can do some scratching. I can play some Nelson Road. I can stop and go on the other side and play some Sidney Bechet and play it. And I can scratch that if I wanted to. Turn it on, put the slide on this side, and here we go. Early blues there, or I could get them both going and fade between the two, and so forth and so on. Okay, obviously I'm not going to do any scratching, but you just have to see this, and you got to dig the coolness that's behind it. And so Spooky told me that this is the cutting edge of technology for the future. In the 19th century, Walter Benjamin said the same thing. He told everybody the cutting edge was montage. And that was true. Montage lasts for a long time. Now Spooky is telling us it is the mix. Now, I'll say this one thing and I'll get off because everything's been arranged. When I was living in Paris, I was like hanging out. I met this guy named Brian Gysin. And most of you don't know who Brian Gysin is, but Brian Gysin did the cut-up technique. He just took a bunch of pieces of paper and cut them up, then he typed them again. William Burroughs discovered that technique from Brian Gysin and wrote these great books out of it. Brian Gysin didn't, he wrote one book or two, but anyway, the point is, he had the idea that cutting up things and dislocating the lineal and bringing in something that's different would be a great thing. And I think that DJ Spooky is absolutely right. I downloaded this application. I worked on it a little bit, and all that came back to me was what Brian Gysin told me, but Brian Gysin himself was like a genius, just unknown. And then, of course, William Burroughs made it famous. So I think that we are on the edge of something really great with DJ Spooky and his fusion writing, black writing. Those of you who are black writers, he's a black writer, but a musician, and discovered something that's unique called the digital turntable as art. So having said that, I'm going to back off, and this is the thing, and he'll be working with you on it. Thank you so much. We have one other person who's going to introduce him, and this is
Joshua Shapiro.
Right, from geology. From geography.
That's right. Does that work? Oh, it's not working. Okay. I'll use this mic now. Thank you.
Well, you can take my thing off, though, right?
Say again?
Yeah.
It's okay. Whatever you want. We'll be all right.
Yeah, I'll just, can I just unplug this?
Sure.
And where are the technicians?
That's okay.
Yeah, okay.
Good. Very good. Thank you, Cecil. It's good to be here. It's been a really good and interesting day. I'm glad to be a part of it. And I think just by way of introducing our esteemed speaker, DJ Spooky, otherwise known as Paul Miller, I'm going to say a few words, I think, just to start about how I came to be introducing him, because I think it actually says something not only about my sort of odd department just down the hill, but also I think about the sort of reach and resonance of his work. And the first thing to say there is that the excellent organizers of this event, the first person they asked to speak here, was the chair of my department, Kurt Cuffey, who is a glaciologist, which is to say he works on ice, on glaciers, which makes sense since Paul's since Paul's work, this new book, The Book of Ice, that makes sense. Kurt, for one reason or another, passed it on to me. I know nothing about ice. I do not work on ice. What I work on basically is music in the Caribbean. And the links, I hope, are going to be sort of implicit here. And I think it says something, though, about DJ Spooky, right, that he's a guy who's as at home at the South Pole as he is in Jamaica, which I think says a lot. I was trying to recall the first time I came into contact with Paul's work, and I think it must have been when I was a teenager. One of my favorite films at that time, a film called Slam. Maybe some of you recall it with Saul Williams. When he's walking in the mall, right, that great score. That's this man here. I recall when I was in college, becoming a real reggae head, right? Some of the sort of great reissues of the old Trojan records. That was DJ Spooky as well. And then skip forward a few years, I was in London. A mutual friend said, DJ Spooky's doing this great thing at the Tate Modern in the Turbine Room. Some of you may know that huge, amazing space there. He was doing a sort of new score to the great von Hindenburg film, Symphony of the City, which I went to. It was fantastic. And I think, to make a long story short, right, since that time, I think he's someone who's really carved out a career at the intersection of the art world, of new media, of writing, of music, that's really shown all the ways in which the intersection of all those places, right, is really the place to be. But that said, and by way of sort of an introduction to this work and the ways in which I sort of responded to the work on Antarctica, I just want to highlight sort of a couple key questions that I think his work provokes in a really interesting way, and especially that sort of speak to me as a geographer or someone who likes to think about place, right? And those two questions, I think, are as follows. And those are, one, how does place still matter? How does place still matter in this age that's often spoken of as post-place or beyond territory, this internet age? And the other question, right, are what are the possibilities for utopia, art-wise and otherwise, and how they relate to digital media and the internet? And I think that his work speaks to those things in some really interesting ways. And to take the first question first, I think a simple and short answer, right, is that place does matter. It does still matter, right? There was all this rhetoric sort of 10 years ago, a place is going to disappear, the internet age doesn't matter, a placeless world. It does matter, right? Landscape matters, place matters. We all exist in some place. Apropos of this conference, right, we all exist in places that are poor places or rich places, that have good access to the internet or not, right? Place does matter, and I think that that's sort of important to foreground. But then to get to this question of utopia, right, and I think it's interesting to look at even the roots of the word. Utopia, right, from the Greek, it means no place. The idea of utopia for a very long time has meant sort of a place that isn't a territory, which is to say it's not, policed, it's not a nation, it doesn't have rules, all these sorts of ideas. And I think the internet, right, is often invoked as a kind of utopian space, as a utopian place. And what I find, by way of sort of bringing this to Antarctica, to Paul's work about Antarctica, right, about a particular kind of place, is that this is a space that's not a territory in the conventional sense, right? It's a place that's owned, if it's owned by anyone, by penguins, right? It's not national, it's not policed. And I think those are the sort of provocative things that he's asking us to think about with Antarctica as metaphor and as place. And interestingly, and this is to sort of bring it to the Caribbean, right? In academics, right, but what we do, we talk about the stuff we know. But the Caribbean, I think the link is here, actually. And that is that the Caribbean, right, is a place, and this is to speak to turntablism, to mixing culture, all these sorts of things, right, is that there's a reason that the Caribbean became the place where dub happened, where DJ culture happened, right? And part of that was about that it was a kind of place where people from all over the world were, that it wasn't a conventional territory, right? People were all new there. And the mix was the key thing here. It was a rhizome blend, right? Roots from all over the place. And that is just to speak to another way, right, in which place does matter. Places are different, places matter. And Antarctica, of course, as we say, a very different kind of place. But I think that what Paul's work does, right, whether he's thinking about Jamaica or thinking about Antarctica, right, is to ask us to think about place, ask us to think about utopia. And I think that he is exceptionally well placed to speak to all those questions. So I'll leave it to him.
Okay, thank you. First and foremost, I just want to say thank you so much to Cecil for putting this together, and thank you, man. It's really a real pleasure to be here. this whole participation occurred because of a recent trip I had to not Antarctica, but to Brazil. I was giving a talk in Bahia in Salvador, which is an incredibly beautiful place. Any human being needs to go to Bahia whenever you have a free moment. Get on a plane, ride a bike, whatever you got to do to go there, check out Bahia. Stunningly beautiful part of Brazil. Right on the edge of Carnival, there was a really interesting conference called Digitalia, which was about non-European approaches to digital culture. And it was curated by a gentleman by the name of Messias, who's from the university in Salvador. And so there's a really interesting connection between Afro-Brazilian culture, mainly from the viewpoint of what they call the Quiombo, which were these kind of free states that the African slaves would create when they escaped from Portuguese colonial rule. So Bahia was a very, very, very intact black culture. And the former prime minister of Brazil had nominated a gentleman from the region named Gilberto Gil to be the Minister of Culture. To make a long story short, I'm sitting next to Gilberto Gil because he's an old friend. He hosted the Antarctica book launch for Brazil. And I want to show you, I always think it's fun to just show a photo. Yeah, so Gilberto Gil is a legendary figure. He started a style of music with Caetano Veloso called Tropicalia. So we're sitting there talking, and another gentleman comes up named Derek, who's friends with Cecil. And he's like, you know, that was amazing, blah, blah, blah. You got to meet my friend Cecil. So, so he emails Cecil. We're standing there. I have my cell phone. And next thing you know, we get an email back pretty quick from Cecil. I had to get on a flight to go from Brazil to Europe. You name it. Next thing you know, just the geography happens. Derek had a flight in the morning. We were all sitting, sipping on some wine, watching the bay in Bahia. So next thing you know, I get an email back saying, all right, done. You're coming to Berkeley. So, and so that's how this all happened. So, I never knew that story. Oh, yeah. Well, Bahia is a great spot. Gilberto Gil, he's a big hero for me. I'd say there's another gentleman who's also quite a big hero for me that I wanted to show you really quick. And this is George Clinton. So I've been teaching him how to DJ a little bit. It's very funny. So, and George, he likes my iPad app as well. You can see he has the same one. So it's kind of an interesting thing because it's a long story. There's two seminal figures who are the two most sampled figures of the 20th century, actually three. Parliament Funkadelic, which has been sampled by Dr. Dre, Ice Cube, Snoop Dogg, you name it. Then the other one is James Brown. James Brown is kind of the DNA of a lot of what's going on, and we're going to tie a couple of loose threads together. I want to kind of, Joshua was talking about geography. What I want to talk about is the idea of the geography of the imagination and how this culture of diaspora, which is why I was referencing Bahia and the Quiombos, where it's the Tropicalia movement and this idea of Afro-diaspora, but also from the viewpoint of pan-humanism, which is to me incredibly important as we move further into the 21st century and everything is getting transformed in ways that we would never have expected in the rear view or forward view mirror of the 20th century's colonial legacies. So when you think about sampling, the first thing that comes to mind is the fragment. Now, to me, what's fascinating about George Clinton and showing him how to mix, it was very funny. We were on CNN Live, and this was us in the studio backstage. You can see all these people running around in the TV studio. So I was showing him, I was like, here's how you make a mix. And so I pulled up some of his tracks from the wireless network at the studio. I just downloaded it really quick. He's like, damn, you got my music on the air. And I was like, no, it's cloud, you know, iTunes, stuff like that. And I was like, no, you know, Parliament, you guys are on iTunes. And we just downloaded it really quick. So I started showing him how to scratch using the software. And so to give him a demo, I just was showing him some of the stuff that I thought would get him just sort of into the mix really quickly because he got a long history. So I'll just show you a quick example of Mind Power by James Brown, but he's one of my favorites. And then I'm going to tie this into this idea of collage because there's some links here. So check it out. Can I get this louder? So that's pretty easy. I would really appreciate it if we can get this louder. Can you tell that it's just the crossfader? He just has to push it up. That's all. So the whole pun here is how do we start thinking about the role of two things. One, graphic design, because what you're seeing is an icon, a record that's been transformed into digital code. So what I wanted to do with the idea of an app is start getting people to start thinking about scripted space and what that means when you're looking at not only how digital media has transformed our relationships to memory, because we're all looking at this idea of collage, density. People who are into data aesthetics like to say yottabyte, exabyte, petabyte. These are ways of describing massive amounts of data that are being generated by our technologies. But the pun here is we can think of memory itself as a kind of topology. And so there's a very famous book by a woman named Frances Yates about the idea of the memory palace. Now, old school, if you go back to like Rome, Roman senators would be able to remember entire speeches by creating structures in memory where they would move you through the memory of whatever they were talking about. So this was the skill of the orator. So what ends up happening as we move further and further into the different, more current time periods is that memory itself becomes a kind of material. And when you start thinking about the idea of recorded media, this gentleman has to come straight into mind. Now, Thomas Edison in the late 19th and early 20th century radically changed our relationships to how we document the idea of memory. So when you hear a sound, there's automatic and associative memory that goes into that. It's the way human beings create meaning. Cognitive scientists such as Oliver Sacks, he has a great book called The Man Who Mistook His Wife for His Hat. There's a lot of people who are studying the idea of the riff and how we think about cognitive perception. But with memory, when you hear a sample, say for example, Proust and this idea of Alors il cherche un temps perdu, which is a great book about the idea of memory and fragments, everything unpacks. You're looking at this idea of a holographic kind of dimensionality to memory. So when you hear a sound, you don't just think of the sound. There's a web network of effect that goes into play immediately. Amusingly enough, Edison thought no one would ever want to listen to a record. In fact, the initial early phonographs were meant to be business dictation devices. And he felt that the first thing to go would be the secretary. Well, we can see where, if you look at Mad Men now, you can see where that went, right? But the pun here is that Edison was also very clever with how he thought about almost all of his inventions. And the other major inventions he was able to be credited with were direct current electricity, the light bulb, and even he invented the electric chair. So, those are all sorts of interesting, twisted things going on. But the idea of direct current and electricity shaped and molded the 20th century as we know it. His main rival, we can think of electricity itself as an operating system. His main rival was a gentleman by the name of Nikola Tesla. And Tesla is kind of a hero for all progressives because he was one of these guys that really got how electricity shaped the imagination. He had a studio on Mulberry Street in downtown Manhattan where he used to throw what they call electricity parties. And now electricity at that time was very new, very wild. And they had World's Fairs where they'd have the electricity palace where you could go see the latest developments and how electricity would change what they called the future city. So if you're at the World's Fair in Chicago, that's considered one of the major turning points. But again, Edison was more of a showman. And he said, now I will show you the future city. And he'd turn on a switch and the whole city went on, So they were able to kind of have a demo that really blew everybody's mind. And direct current became the way that we think about the beginnings of electricity. But Edison was wrong. Amusingly enough, Tesla had a better system, alternating current, AC, and he also had wireless electricity. I had the honor to visit Tesla's home in Serbia. I was in Belgrade a couple weeks ago, and I had a concert at Omladin, which is a really interesting contemporary arts center. So the curators came backstage after the show, and they said, well, you're from New York. We know that you're Americans and electricity, and there's a lot of this like anti-NATO, anti-American graffiti throughout Serbia, because we bombed them, And I was like, okay, Serbian, what's going on? And so the next morning I go to visit the Tesla Institute. So the curator gives me a light bulb, walks across the room, says, hold this for a second, flicks a switch, and the light bulb comes on. And it's because my nervous system was conducting electricity. And so the curator gave me a whole walkthrough of how we could have, if we had not followed Edison's route, we wouldn't need, say, for example, Edison also had a direct patent relationship to Edison General Electric, right? So all the coal power plants, nuclear power, all the sorts of different ways that the 20th century got shaped by the idea of mass electricity, we would have gone a different route. Tesla felt that we could have wireless electricity, electricity coming out of the Earth's magnetic sphere, so we wouldn't need wires at all anymore. In fact, you wouldn't even need power plants. So he had meetings with people like Rockefeller, And Rockefeller was like, oh yeah, Edison told me about you. You're that guy who's talking about free electricity. Get out of here. You know, I don't make any money off of that. So if you visit Edison's home in New Jersey across the river from New York, the light bulbs in his place are still the same ones from 100 years ago. And it's because they built in planned obsolescence. So you'd have to keep buying more and more light bulbs. Or if you got direct current, you have to keep buying more and more electricity, so they have to get more and more coal. And guess who owned the coal? Which was Rockefeller, Carnegie, and so on, his early investors. So my motto is always follow the dollar signs. And it's an interesting, oops, that's an ad, there we go. This is the concert in Serbia, and so I had a Serbian string quartet playing that I was sampling live through my iPad app. And, you know, it was a really interesting moment because electricity, if you really think about the way it's shaped, I'm going to go silent for just a second, you'll hear hum. Now, the American electrical grid is so extensive that we're on 110 versus 220 volts. Seismologists have studied, literally, if you ever take a tuning fork, the whole of American cities, the entire continent is vibrating with electricity. There are so many wires everywhere. There's an ambient hum throughout the entire continental shelf. So we're looking at how electricity has shaped hip-hop, techno, dubstep, all these musics that come out of the urban landscape. And I'm very interested in getting to what I like to call the reset button on this. So when you think about electricity and operating systems, one of the first things that kind of comes to mind is the way Edison and Tesla had this rivalry, but now we fast forward to here, where, of course, Apple, Google OS, all the different ways that people are organizing the data that drives our culture at this point. Now closed versus open systems, how people think about the way they structure the idea of sound. The record, again, we still go back to the beginning of all this. The record was the first format of how people really thought about being able to have playback culture. For me, when you look at a record, the first thing I now think about is the playlist. But we're now in the post-playlist era. So how people organize sound, how people think about the way they relate to any kind of organized data, and especially in the cultural field, is through these kinds of templates. In my last book, I worked with, and we researched all sorts of different composers. I had 36 composers write about their compositional strategy. Some of the stuff that came out of that went into the book. It's called Sound Unbound, and that was with composers like Steve Reich, Moby, Pierre Boulez had to do an interview. And one of the favorite moments of the book was we tracked down the guy who invented the record cover sleeve. He was still alive. He just passed away recently. His name's Alex Steinweiss. He's considered one of the most important graphic designers of the 20th century, but he's a very hidden kind of guy. So one day in the 20s and early 30s, he walked into RCA Victor and a couple other spots and said, why are record cover sleeves blank? Why don't we put an image on the cover? And so that was the idea of how we think of graphic design's relationship to sound. If you think about the postcard, if you think about the idea of the stamp, those were networks that were predating all of our digital media. People were being able to send images, use the streets as a canvas, put up posters. But the record cover sleeve radically changed the way we think about sound because it was visual. So today what I want to do is walk you guys through a couple of my current projects, and I want to give a big shout out to Sandy Poindexter. She's an incredible violinist. And what I'm going to do is riff on a piece that I wrote in Antarctica. Now, the fun part about Antarctica, but I'm just going to play one thing and then we'll, yeah, just a quick example here. The fun thing about Antarctica is it's this blank space at the edge of the map. And what's fascinating about it is that it's the only place on Earth with no government. Now, 70% of the world's fresh water is in Antarctica, and over 90% of its landmass is covered with ice. So basically, I took a studio there and went to make what I call acoustic portraits of ice. So this is me hanging out with a lot of penguins. You know, and so I was starting to think about getting out of the city and what would happen if you hit the reset button on the contemporary imagination of what is blackness or whiteness or humanity in general. It's so cold if you're in this kind of spot that if you fall in the water, you die in about 2 minutes. So we're not engineered for this environment. It's actually like another planet almost. It's very, very, quite beautiful. And the hard part about writing music about this from a hip-hop point of view was downtown. I just have the streets, the grid. You know, if you're in New York, you're on 1st Street, 2nd Street, 3rd Street. You can think of that as the crucible of most of American music, the grid. Now, if you look at Detroit and the Motown sound, if you think about Chicago, LA, the grid shapes the American imagination. So when I was in this kind of landscape, you're in the idea of hitting the reset on what it meant to even be a composer or creative at all. The hardest part was finding a human scale. And you got to imagine how big those mountains are. So I started doing research of how other composers had engaged landscape and was thinking about the historical relationship with how people look at composition in general. This is a score by Cornelius Cardew, who's one of my favorite composers from the 60s, sort of progressive leftist composer. But above all, I had to go back to hip-hop and start thinking about Ice. This is Iceberg Slim, and you guys being in the West Coast, black culture has a deep, long relationship with ice. People are like, why, you know, you're black, why would you want to go to Antarctica? I was like, black people love ice. We got Ice Cube, Ice Tea, you know. If you got the white guy, you got Vanilla Ice, you know. So the whole notion here is we're looking at a kind of a Freudian relationship. And the reason I'm using Freud is the notion of the cold motherfucker. It's like one of those kind of hip-hop motions of bling, right? You know, ice, the ice grill. There's a lot of layers of metaphor that go into how people think about environmental stuff in an urban context. But the environment for us is, again, an imaginary landscape. How do you think of the poetry of someone like him, which is the DNA of hip-hop, where he's rhyming about ice, he's always talking about the coldness and stuff like that. But going from that into the physics, I started working with a gentleman by the name of Brian Greene, who wrote a book called The Elegant Universe. He's a very renowned quantum physicist, and we were kind of going back and forth on some of the physics of ice. And one of the first things to come to mind is it's a material of patterns. Now, whenever you see a piece of ice, you're seeing a hexagon form, and you can see how it kind of folds in on itself. There's a very beautiful symmetry in snow and ice. You're seeing the same pattern. Now, there's a fractal dimension, and this is basically, if you're anybody out there who's a mathematician, you have a very simple set of rules that can generate extreme complexity. And whenever you see a piece of ice, that kind of permutation is in effect. So it's the changing same. Now, Amiri Baraka coined that term. It's a great term to think about black music. It's a great way to think about how people look at repetition. But in nature, it's actually an extension of all sorts of deeply complex structures and how the rise of material kind of transforms between liquid and solid. The mathematicians call it a phase transition. So what I wanted to do was start thinking about the physics of ice from the viewpoint of kind of looking at it as an archive. And so I was looking at other composers, historians. This is Caspar David Friedrich, The Wanderer Above Fog. In the 19th century, the idea of nature was a big deal, so you had the German Expressionist movement. And in the US, we had people like Walt Whitman, Thoreau, Emerson. They were trying to figure out the idea of the American relationship to nature in general. But amusing enough, the Germans took this in a really twisted direction and ended up with something like this, you know, Tatte der Musik and Tatte der Kunst. And the remix of that was Jewish and black music was banned by Hitler because he hated jazz. Long story, he couldn't play it, you know. And he was also a bad painter, and most of the really good painters were Jewish, so he said, get these guys out of here. You know, so what ended up happening is a lot of the major Jewish composers, Ernst Korngold, Krenek, they ended up fleeing to Hollywood, and they changed the way that we think of the soundtrack. So in the 1930s and 40s, jazz was persecuted during the Weimar Republic. Long story. The reason I'm kind of hoping you guys I'm doing this collage as we speak of bits and pieces of my talk. So to make a long story short, Antarctica, blank space, huge space, not necessarily so good for human beings. Let's figure out how to make compositions out of that. So the whole pun here was I ended up thinking about landscape from this point of view and then transforming it into data. So I took a studio to the ice and went out and did sort of data set recordings and to look at temperature differentials, thermal dynamics, wind currents, air currents, and then transcribed that into these weather graphs and algorithmic music transcriptions and generated tones from the data set. Actually, weather is actually a deeply complex phenomena, and at this point, the U.S. military now considers weather a weapon. You'd be surprised. But once you get the data set of it, it's called, you know, sample it. That's all a sample is a data set. So if you look at the U.S. Census, they don't measure everybody in the U.S. They get small slivers of each community, and that data set then generates the whole. So what I'm tying here is looking at how complexity comes from very simple set rules, but also, above all, how people start thinking about the complexity of when you sample and quote something. There's all sorts of associative contexts that go into play. In fact, the tension between context and content is where the mix comes into play. So with the compositions that you're about to hear, the music was generated not only by the quote-unquote science of data sets, but I wanted to get into what I call the impressionist landscape as well. So I looked at Debussy's La Mer, for example, or one of the first compositions for turntables was from 1939. It's a gentleman by the name of John Cage. And then looking at symmetry. This is what they call a shepherd's tone, and it's ascending and descending simultaneously. So it kind of makes, if you hear it in a techno song or hip hop song, you hear these kind of sweeping upward tone and then maybe down, like Dr. Dre uses it a lot, for example. But the transcription of that, above all, was meant to be a kind of a dual purpose situation. So you're not only seeing symmetry in sound, but you're starting to think about how symmetry in nature functions. And this is what they call an ice core sample. Scientists go to Antarctica to study weather phenomena and the traces left in the ice. So if they dig down, every couple meters is a couple million years. So the continent is kind of like a huge record. And the idea of ice core sampling, it tells you if there was dust in the air, if there was a volcanic explosion, if there is plastic or dust, anything gets trapped in the ice eventually. So you're sampling the landscape. Now, one of my favorite guys thinking about this is a gentleman by the name of Johannes Kepler. And in 1611, he was walking on his way home, and a snowflake landed on his sleeve. And he was stunned by the beautiful mathematical complexity of this simple piece of phenomena that landed on his sleeve. So he ended up going home and writing an essay called 6 Sides of a Snowflake. And it's considered to be one of the first times natural philosophy engaged mathematics, complexity theory, and the idea of weather. So the geometry, if you start getting into how people think about that, when you look at a natural phenomena like this landscape, one of the most beautiful things for me was how do you get the human scale? So this first piece is called Tide and Tariff. And Senna, you ready? We're going to jump into that. I just kind of want to leave this impression of this vast sense of ice, but from a hip-hop point of view. And by the way, my app, it's available freely on the iTunes Store. I'll just show you really quick. It's called just DJ Spooky. Oops. Yeah, there we go. And basically what I'm going to be doing is running it through everything that would be online. But if you like it or whatever, and want to remix it, feel free to download, remix, transform. I'm totally into open source media. The pun here is you're seeing a tension between a traditional instrument and something where I've taken a contemporary software aesthetic and tried to unpack some of the historical materials. The pun is this about networks, but it's also about shareware. And when I was coming up with the project, I was trying to figure out the form of how you would program the turntable, and then getting people to start thinking about sampling, graphic EQ, effects, and above all, being able to loop and layer, which is part of the turntable's aesthetic. I'll get into repetition a little bit. So what you're going to hear is a tension between a piece that was written as an impressionist engagement with Antarctica, and above all, just thinking about, you know, what the creative process between turntables and violin, turntables and string ensemble is, and symmetry. So here we go. You ready? I'm going to need louder. Oh, Sandy Poindexter. So what you were just seeing and hearing is a conversation between instruments from radically different time periods. And the violin has a long history, but the app is actually quite new. Apple, what's so fascinating is you got to remember the iPad's only been out about 2 years, and in that short amount of time, over 25 billion apps have been downloaded. So you can just do the math on that and think about the amount of creativity that's been unleashed in a very, very, very short amount of time. So the app, to me, is kind of now unpacking this idea of what is an instrument. Above all, it's a scripted space that's activated by touch. So the whole notion here is how do we start thinking of a new kind of literacy for thinking about the way people exchange and create culture in this era. And that's what I think Cecil was going for and Greg has been going for with this conference. So what you were just hearing, I notated and wrote out like this, but in the book, what I wanted to do was start thinking about graphic design and notation and loops and layers. So I did a series of ways of kind of getting notation and scripts into collage form and being able to make the material come out of these kind of QR code prints. And the concert was, it's a very large scale piece. I'll just show you. The QR codes activate each chapter. And what you can see is if you hold your phone up to it or your iPad or whatever, it brings you into the kind of compositional materials. And they're also playable by String Quartet Live, but they're also, this is going to be a show at the Met Museum. It's been premiered at a whole bunch of different museums and galleries. So the pun is, how do we start thinking about the conversions between what a hip-hop producer would think about with sampling and collage from old records versus what I'm doing is sampling and collaging from old compositions. So when you hear a riff, I'll just play you one example really quick just to give you, I bet you everybody in the room will know this riff, I'm sure. 1 second, here we go. If you hear this. Right, So the pun here is what you were hearing as I took bits and pieces from other composers that had dealt with weather or with the idea or the phenomenon of nature and started going through the, digging in the crates for that. So I was looking at Handel's Water Music, for example, or Debussy's La Mer, or for that matter, John Cage's piece Imaginary Landscape, which was the first composition written for turntables. But I also started thinking about how painters have been thinking about loops as well. So one of my favorite writers is a gentleman by the name of Douglas Hofstadter, and he has a really good book called Gödel, Escher, Bach. Now, Bach was the guy who really got riffs, and when you think about Beethoven, Mozart, and other composers, they all went to bars, they hung out, and for them, classical music was kind of a party music. For Escher, you have to remember he's writing and making these kinds of beautifully complex mathematical materials in the same way that, if I just draw a link really quick, you can easily see a connection between that and this. So the perception of complexity and the idea of involution and repetition of form, those are things that I think painters, artists, composers have gotten. Say, for example, Stravinsky. Stravinsky is considered one of the premier composers of the 20th century, and one of his earliest memories was of sounds of ice breaking along a river near his home during the winter. So the idea of modernism and noise, the way people started thinking about letting different forms come in. If you start thinking about the remix, this is Obama and Bush's face. This is a mashup. The remix is something where you play with the familiar, and where, say for example, Sigmund Freud had his term called the unheimlich, the uncanny. The 20th century was all about this notion of the human body being put in a context where technology was taking elements out of context of what expression. The telephone separates the voice from the body. The TV separates the image from the body, and so on and so on. So this is where Derek had said, hey, you got to meet Cecil. Derek is a specialist in Marshall McLuhan. He's the head of Marshall McLuhan Center in Toronto. And me and him went back and forth with Gilberto Gil one evening. We were all just talking about the Tropicalia movement and sampling. It was a long conversation. But the remix in the 20th century versus 21st is our way of thinking about the idea of electronic music as a new form of folk vocabulary. So with the Antarctica compositions, what I was trying to figure out is how do we start getting people to think about the poetry of nature and what is the concept of how the city has a tension with the idea of natural form. And when you think about hip-hop, techno, dubstep, drum and bass, all of these styles that come out of the vernacular of the grid, what I was trying to figure out was the photography and the kind of containment of these ended up being a kind of a graphic design exploration of what I like to call the People's Republic of Antarctica. And what I ended up doing was making a kind of a graphic design piece that was basically all about getting people to think about sampling historical graphic design materials and coming up with a book project. The book's available out there, and it's also a free ebook if you're into the kind of download thing. So let me just play you a quick clip of one of my favorite guys who really gets sampling. His name's Méliès. And what you're going to see here is he's made copies of himself. He's one of my favorite filmmakers precisely because he was a magician who wanted to apply magic technique to film. So what this is going to show you from 1900, the art form of editing. And I'll pull this into the next composition. You'll see in a second.
En 1900, il y a donc presque 100 ans, Méliès représente ce qu'il était réellement dans la vie, un homme orchestre.
So what you were just seeing there was in 1900, the idea of collage and the idea of editing had converged. Other artists like John Hartfeld, for example, did a really fun series of political critiques of Hitler, for example. Those are very famous pieces. But with the jazz age, especially with composers like Scott Joplin, who ended up in Europe, or Josephine Baker, they brought this composition style to Europe and also to other spots in the world. If you look at like the Shanghai High Step, for example, the jazz aesthetic really transformed so many aspects of the world at that time that now when we update to hip-hop, you can see a similar thing. This next piece I want to play is called Isonification, and I want to just play you a quick clip that I'm doing with Sci-Fi Channel, just to give you a kind of little bit of a context. It's just 1 second here. What I've been doing with Sci-Fi Channel is we took a lot of my Antarctica project and we put it between a lot of shows, so it's kind of infotainment about the near future of climate change. You'll see in a second. Here we go.
Let's imagine the things you see every day in nature actually contain secret sounds. DJ Spooky went to Antarctica, and where others heard silence, he heard music. He took the visual patterns of the melting continent and created a living symphony. You've heard that the environment is changing, but you've never heard it like this. DJ Spooky imagined greater.
Your turn.
Go to let'simagingreater.com.
So, Sci-Fi Channel is one of those kind of, like, I like Battlestar Galactica, for example, you know, so, okay. So I was like, how do we communicate with kids and get them into thinking about the near future of climate change? Because you got to speak the vocabulary of the youth. You know, that's how it works. So we took the Antarctica material, which was usually very kind of like for graduate students and stuff like that, and was thinking about, all right, if you get people to start thinking about portraits, this is some of the portraits I was doing when I was down and also on the North Pole. So I went and just revisited how people thought about what it is to be in this kind of notion of the imaginary. And I did research. This is Henderson. He's the African American who helped discover the North Pole, but it's usually a hidden variable in this idea of the ice. You know, going back into time, one of the fun parts about this was the research alone. Like, you want to talk about digging in the crates. It's definitely one of those moments where you realize that how much hidden histories there are. And the North and South Pole are incredibly, stunningly beautiful places that very few people have been to. I just want to show you one example, then we're going to get into the next piece, which is called isonification. Two of my favorite theoreticians of the subconscious, there's a funny moment when you start thinking about the history of a dispute. And that's, this is Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung near the North Pole. And they had a big beef. You know, Sigmund Freud felt that Jung was his disciple, and he was pissed off that dream theory was taking off. What's that? The taller one is, guess. Just guess. Yeah, Freud. No, Freud is the shorter one. Sorry, Jung is the taller one. Yeah. Freud's face, you can see he has a sharp nose. But the fun part about these two is that the idea of psychoanalysis and the idea of dream theory, people were trying to figure out the subconscious. And the fun thing about sampling is you play with memory in a way that is very deep structured relationships that somehow come out in all the ways that people look at cognitive perceptions of pattern. So the reason these two went to the North is that they had a big dispute, and Jung felt he got dissed by Freud, and they barely spoke again for years. They had a big falling out. It's a legendary falling out in psychoanalysis. But you know, I'm sure people are still in therapy over it, right? But so the vocabulary for me is, how do we start thinking about what is the concept of nature, not just about human, because African American, white, black, Latino, all these categories are radically changing, and I give up on it at this point. The world is a remix. It's just, that's the way it is. But the idea of nature is something that's very much a pan-humanist issue that affects everyone. So much of my work has been like sort of exploring that from the viewpoint of sampling. And I just want to play one other quick clip before we get into the next piece. When I first started doing a lot of my multimedia art projects, I wanted to kind of figure out the history of how people thought about representation in cinema and in collage and so on. So I was drawn almost inevitably to D.W. Griffith. And I got the rights to D.W. Griffith's film, Birth of a Nation. He left his estate to Harvard and Sonoma, and we got in touch with Criterion Pictures, and I remixed it. And the idea was to kind of create a situation where you have a kind of collage aesthetic applied to the notion of what is a cinematic experience. But the fun part about doing that project is we got the Greek government to give me the Acropolis for an evening. And so we projected the film throughout the ruins of the Acropolis. And the Acropolis represents for Western culture this kind of intense sense of permanence and very high culture kind of scene. So we had, I put huge bass speakers throughout the ruins. This is hip-hop, this is how we do it. You can see the bass, you know. So this is, there we go. But, so the Greek government, it was kind of funny, you know. They were like, but why do you want to play a KKK film at the Acropolis? You know, and I said, you guys are Greek, you know, you got comedy, tragedy, and they're like, oh, we get it, you know. So the fun part about doing this project is the film was about remixability, impermanence, transience, and we had, again, it was a sold-out show. We had about 5,000 people come out. So hi, everybody, thanks for coming to the show. I think I'm the first DJ to play here in 3,000 years. Thanks for coming. You know. And how people can start thinking about the remix is something that I think, as we move further into the 21st century, the idea that geography is still very important because it's about place, it's about memory, it's about the idea of authenticity. But a sample is something that is about navigating the ambiguity of place. So the pun here is, how do we get people to really think about this notion that the imagination itself is the ultimate renewable resource? And as we move further into the 21st century and climate change, last year, for example, half of Texas was on fire. You guys here in California were getting all burned up. You know, we had record-level storms, immense amounts of damage. And if you look at any Republican, you can ask them what planet they're on. I don't know. It's really... But no, seriously, you know, it's incredible stuff happening. And on top of it, the idea of climate change denial is still very much in vogue in the sort of right wing. Yeah, it's very real. But
I just have to say a comment about that.
Mm-hmm.
It was under the Nixon administration.
The EPA, yeah.
So you shouldn't really generalize.
Yeah.
I don't think that's a fair assessment.
That's a good point. And don't forget, you know, but Teddy Roosevelt also helped set up a lot of the national parks, and he's in front of the American Museum of Natural History being held up by an Indian and a black guy. I mean, it's, you know, so there is a lot of perception that Nixon was an evil, vicious guy, and he was, so, but, you know, he did the EPA, which is great. I give credit where it's due. Okay, well, this is a longer debate, and I'm happy to open that up. But what I want to do, say, as a kind of a core theme, and I'm hopefully, don't forget, seriously, when I finish the formal presentation, I'd like to bring this back to the forum, is this. It's not about facts for these guys. It's not about data. It's about the rhetoric of they're in the pocket of these huge multinational corporations dealing with all sorts of different kinds of ways of shaping how they think about energy and policy should be set. So Indian Point, for example, right above New York City, it's the same exact design as Fukushima. You won't hear a peep about that. Last summer, a guy fell asleep and forgot to turn off the off switch on the cooling systems, and 200,000 gallons of radioactive steam were released over New York. Didn't hear a peep about it. Fukushima, do you want that in your neighborhood? No. So what I'm trying to figure out is, not only is it how, it's not particular to any administration. Obama's hamstrung on a lot of levels at the moment. That one could argue the Republicans and Democrats, that's a whole different debate right now, but at the end of the day, some people are based on facts and scientific analysis of climate change, which is very real. It's almost indisputable that there's massive amounts of climate change going on. Would you, you know, yeah. No, it's okay. Okay, but you know, let's put it this way: parts per million. If you say that to Newt Gingrich, he'll ask you, "Where's my bank account?" Let's put, you know. Anyway, so on a lighter note, this is me in 1972. Amusing enough, my father was the lawyer for the Black Panthers, and he was dean of Howard University's law school in the '60s, and he did not like Nixon very much. So it's in downtown Washington D.C. in the 1970s. That's Thurgood Marshall next to my dad and Supreme Court Justice Douglas. This is our living room in 1968. And DuPont Circle, anybody know D.C.? DuPont? Okay. Oh, Connecticut and R, that's my old house. Our old house is now teaism. Anybody like green tea? It's a good tea spot. But, so to make a long story short, I think that we need to get people to re-energize about how the debate can be reframed, because right now it's not about facts, and much of the debate and rhetoric, if you saw the last several Republican debates, which was just like, wow. So with that said and done, let's go back to Rebirth of a Nation. So when I was kind of coming up with this idea of multimedia and reframing things, you had to deal with Griffith. Griffith is one of these guys who's a master of all sorts of evil and twistedness, but also very clever with it. Same with Leni Riefenstahl or Sergei Eisenstein. They know how to push the emotional buttons and how film shaped the role of people of color in most of the 20th century. The rise of the minstrel show, for example, and blackface. Birth of a Nation, it's one of those moments where in film history it's taught as a film that defined ethnicity in film. So let me just play you a quick clip from this. It's an excerpt. I'll just take a second.
Smoke?
Oh, thank you.
Is that D.W. Griffith?
Yes.
He made The Birth of a Nation.
Now I want to ask you a question.
Fire ahead.
When you made The Birth of a Nation, you feel as though it were true?
The Klan at that time was needed and served a purpose. Yes, I think it's true.
President Woodrow Wilson, the 28th President of the United States, the son of Confederate sympathizers, struggles with an escalating war in Europe, a woman's right to vote, and a country still recovering from a devastating civil war. While in the throes of his attempt to create the League of Nations in 1915, Woodrow Wilson saw a very different vision for the internal political situation in America than he did with his international idealism. The League of Nations was an attempt to foster what he called an organization to end all wars. To premiere his vision, he invited his close friend and fellow Confederate son D.W. Griffith to screen The Birth of a Nation at the White House, making it the first film to play there in American history. The Birth of a Nation set the tone for how film portrayed history. It still fuels the debate about how much progress has or hasn't occurred, its impact on society, and whether such a film should have ever been made. In modern 21st century America, a world of red states and blue states, the Birth of a Nation hangs as a specter over the political process. Ultimately, The Birth of a Nation is about conflict. It shows us controversy and a deep ignorance of history in the form of a film once described by Woodrow Wilson as writing history with lightning. There was something in the tradition of America's first pop culture phenomenon, the minstrel show, showing multiple ideas about American identity, and set the tone for the 21st century's revisionist landscape, where media in the absence or presence of a story in that media could set off a war, or could literally create a vision of democracy rising in the deserts of another foreign occupied nation. The Rebirth of a Nation looks at Griffith's vision of America tied together with never-before-seen close-ups and innovative techniques, and turns them on themselves to make a film from the viewpoint of DJ culture. The turntable moves to become the projector. The projector becomes the multimedia file. And all of those things look back through history as a digital media where stories can be made as we go. The Rebirth of a Nation is a DJ mix applied to cinema. It's been said that those who don't learn from history are doomed to repeat it. But what happens if we break the cycle?
How does Pontius Pilate said, truth? What is the truth?
So that's Steve W. Griffith, and it was a real pleasure to kind of dig into the archival footage and all sorts of stuff about the role that cinema played in shaping a lot of issues in the 20th and now 21st century relationship to multimedia. So this next piece is called Isonification, and what I wanted to do was look at data sets, like I was showing you earlier. Just to give you an idea, what ends up happening with this piece is I took a whole bunch of material and distilled it from the data that we generated while I was there, and I also did an artist residency at Dartmouth's Cold Regions Research Labs, and then applied that to these ideas of algorithmic music transcriptions, transcribed into keyboard tones. Oops, that's Korea, different one. And then took that and then put it into what they call Maxim SP patches. So everything you're about to hear is generated from the viewpoint of taking an algorithm that defines a snowflake, which is actually just a mathematical code, and I was able to take that and generate visual material. So this next piece is a short piece called Isonification, and just think of the mathematics of it, because what the beauty of nature is that there are rules that have somehow created stunning complexity, and just think about that as we watch. 1 second here. You ready? Okay, 1 second. It's going to take a second to load. Okay. So what you were just seeing was basically a math set, again, taken from these ice core samples and looking at the idea of geometry and sound. Various other composers like Yannis Xenakis, the early Greek tuning systems, much of the work of geometry gets translated into mathematics, which gets translated into tuning systems. So for the Western model, that was a very beautiful experience for me to be able to kind of start thinking about how much these kinds of situations unfold. So recently I was curated into the Gwangju Biennial, which was curated by the artist Ai Weiwei, who's a very renowned Chinese artist. And he had my Antarctica piece. This is a show of the concert. We had, again, about 5,000 plus people come to the show. I was projecting all the material. This is when we were setting up during the afternoon, and you can just kind of get a feel for more of a large-scale situation. So I was DJing a Korean string quartet playing the same compositions that you're hearing now, but again, a little bit larger scale. What I'm fascinated with right now is that idea of what you were saying earlier, symmetry, and the Shepard's tone functions and other couple mathematic functions that go into those involutionary processes. So I'm going to end with this last piece. This is called Ein Klein Nachtmusik. I'm going to be kind of riffing on this idea of open source media. So the pun here is Adam Smith wrote a very famous essay in the 18th century called Of Water and Diamonds. He was very fascinated with why people would go to war over diamonds, which are very scarce material, versus water, which is essential to life. And so diamonds in hip-hop are called ice, the bling. The pun here is not only is water much more a part of the basic fabric of everyday living on this planet, but if you actually think about it, it turns your sense of values upside down. So why people pay more for diamonds, they'll go to war for diamonds, they'll enslave entire nations just to take resources. If you look at Rwanda or Congo, for example. So he was very fascinated with that paradox of values. So when he went on to write Wealth of Nations, I think that was something that was really resonant with my work. And the idea of music of numbers is what's going on here. So this last piece, it's just kind of an invocation of some of the ideas that I think Adam Smith was looking at with this idea of values in how we think about economics, how we think about consumerism, and above all, the pun is looking at how the sampling and software have turned upside down the idea of value. So my iPad app, we've had over 11 million downloads, and it's been one of Apple's top music downloads. So the whole idea is to take free material, which Antarctica is, again, the only place on Earth. If you think about ice, who owns the ice, right? And be able to kind of think about transcribing that, think about making it loops, elements, layers, like I was showing you earlier with my ebook and the physical book, and then be able to think about the iPad itself as a kind of compositional tool. So I got a quick question. Actually, Cecil, you'll probably know this one, but I don't give it away just yet. How many of you guys know Adolphe Sax? Anybody? He's the guy who invented the saxophone. So if you had the saxophone as a tool that defined an entire musical style, it has a lot of history. It was previously used for military marching bands and so on. The violin has a tremendous amount of history. The piano has a tremendous amount of history. But the iPad app literally has only been around for less than a couple years. So we're looking at the creation of music instruments out of software at a rate that's unprecedented in human history. It's like inventing a new guitar or a new kind of guitar every couple days. So the whole pun is that apps have transformed not only visuality and compositional strategy, but above all, they've unleashed a wave of creativity. And like I said before, 25 billion apps have been downloaded through the Apple Store. That's more than any book ever written, more than any words even spoken by human beings. I mean, 25 billion is a lot. So if we've had 11 million of that, which is a good number, that's a drop in the bucket compared to like Angry Birds. They've had like 300 million plus. So when I came with this app, we got in very early. Apple was very supportive. We haven't made a Google Android one yet, but I'm going to get around to that later. But this last piece, just want to do that, and we'll open up the questions, Cecil, and we'll take it from here. Okay. What's that? Okay. I'm going to just go back to tweak the sound for a second, because it's been a little bit uneven. 1 second. you know, it's kind of funny. I could probably be controlling the sound system wirelessly anyway, because we have this function called Wi-Fi Party, but I don't have control of the mixing board, which is, it is what it is. All right. Oh, there's one thing. You know what? I'm going to get out of sequence a little bit before I do this. You know, Sonny, let me just play one clip for a second to show them what I'm doing. Okay. So before I get into playing this, I want to show you a piece called Copyright Criminals. It's a piece that was done by Kimber McLeod and Jonathan Fraser. And I helped put it together. They're friends of mine. The idea is I wanted to show collage aesthetics and sampling before we do this piece, so you'll get an idea. Here we go.
Say someone recorded this sound. So does that mean they own it if I go?
If you sample one note of a sound recording, it's copyright infringement.
It's actually taking sounds and meshing them together and putting them all in time to come up with something totally different.
By ignoring the rules, they came up with a whole new way of thinking about music.
Always buying records, searching. That bass line.
We grabbed conga sounds, trumpet sounds, violin sounds, drum beat sounds, and remanipulated and created our own music.
Basically, when I'm sampling, I have all these artists. They're in my band.
You can't just have a record that's made up of everybody else's records and then not pay them for it.
You pay for a guitar, you pay for a piano, you pay for anything else that you make a song with.
At the end of the day, the court said, not only is this copyright infringement, but we see criminal prosecution in line for this one.
Some of those first sampling cases, De La Soul, Biz Markie, P.E., and others, it wasn't that they were trying to be thieves or trying not to get caught. It was just like, we kind of didn't know.
Sampling was a very intricate thing for us. We was creating a collage.
We kind of looked at music as an assemblage of sounds, and we felt that you couldn't copyright a sound.
Well, welcome to the Terror Dome.
So many groups unsample my stuff. They say I'm the world's #1 samplist drummer, so hey, I haven't got a penny for it yet though, but I'm Clyde Stubblefield, the original funky drummer.
His name never appears on any of those compositional credits. He doesn't get royalties. He got paid for the time in the studio.
My music is my life. Pop, baby.
Look, nobody took hip-hop seriously until it started making a lot of money.
Then, naturally, the lawyers moved in.
It became kind of a feasting frenzy.
People were getting sued for the music they were making.
Yeah, I got sued for sampling my own stuff.
I've sued and I've been sued. That's the nature of the business.
For me, I felt like, wow, we're popular now. I'm getting sued by somebody I don't even know.
You're either rich enough to afford the law, or you're a complete outlaw.
If you can catch me, then I didn't do my job. They got so much technology today, they can, the speed go up or whatever they want to do with it, and I won't even know it's me.
Look at how any bit of culture is made. It's about taking bits and pieces of your influences and forging them into something newer and stronger.
That's how society moves forward. It doesn't just invent new things. It evolves through taking old things and changing them.
Go ahead, sample whatever you want.
Court, now in court because I stole the beat. This is a sampling court.
All right. So that's a film that it's called Copyright Criminals. I'd like to kind of just invoke that before we get into this, because who owns the ice, you know? And the pun here is that Antarctica is the only place on Earth with no government, and the whole notion of going there as a composer, as an artist, as a writer, was to get people to start thinking about climate change as a pan-humanist issue. You know, this is going to be dedicated to everyone out there who, you know, looks at pan-humanism as, I think, the path forward for a 21st century situation. So, if we can just kind of, you ready? Okay. It's going to take a second to load here. All right, here we go. Oh, I'll cue this. Okay. So she's from here. It's local treasure, inspired. Thank you so much, Tisha, for setting this up. And Sandra Poindexter. Let's give her some love again. So I guess that's the end of my discussion. And I just want to say the book just came out, and I think there's copies available out there. But if there's not any more, it's a free ebook. If you scroll down to the web thing, you can just see free, right? So it's, you know, all sorts of stuff, science, art, graphic design. And thank you guys for having me.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Do you want to go through questions? Okay. So
we're going to have a performance from Tracy out in the lobby. Where she's going to give a tutorial for the dance, and then we're going to eat and drink. But before we eat and drink, we're going to have to we're going to do the tutorial, and then we're going to eat and drink. So
here's Tracy Barlow. Please welcome Tracy. All right. And we're going to take 3 questions for DJ Spooky. Yes, 3 questions. 1, 2. Okay, only 2 questions? 3. 1, 2, 3. Okay, let's go.
Great talk. Loved everything. Another question about your app. It seems really cool and powerful, and it seems we also like just took what you can do with the Serato system and physically mapped it down there. Have you thought about some other things that is not like you take tools on an open touch space, but you can do a lot more expression?
Oh, sure. I mean, some other friends of mine have been showing, a lot of people are into this idea of post playlists, so I'll just show you an example. But yeah, I mean, I wanted to make something that was very intuitive and that would allow people to get very quickly into DJing. Say, for example, this is an app some friends of mine developed that takes all of your sounds and puts them into kind of word cloud formats, depending on, and so the post playlist, if you think of all of the different material that can kind of be associated with any sound, they made it become mathematical kind of relationships that are based on how frequently they occur, and then to put them into kind of a data cloud, which I kind of thought was a nice way of visualizing it, and the connections between songs. So yeah, that's their app. Mine is, we've had a lot more. We've had about 11 million downloads. So we wanted to make it very accessible and something that people would be able to get up and start DJing within 5 minutes. We also, you know what, I'll just show you really quick. We made it also have video capability. So you can take music videos from YouTube channels and be able to mix them because we have video out. And you can see, you know, so you can make, instead of record playlists, you make video playlists. And then you can mix them in the crossfader at the bottom there as well. So video, and we also made it available so that you can DJ with Wi-Fi over a wireless sound systems, so that I can walk around a room and not be physically in the DJ booth at all. And a lot of sound systems are now have wireless networks. So, and last but not least, one of the more fun options, regretfully you guys can't see it because it's cut off at the bottom. There's an area, there's a red dot that you can press play while I'm DJing, and everyone in the room who has the same Wi-Fi network can download the mix live while I'm spinning. So you can leave the party or the club with the same mixes. And so that's why it's been pretty popular.
Mm-hmm. All right, next question.
I just have a really quick question. I really liked the video of the mathematical equation that was creating those ice things. Mm-hmm. Is there anywhere to see that?
Yeah, it's on the website. If you go to the Sound Unbound and or the Book of Ice sites, there's a lot of data between the different chapters. And the QR codes in the actual book or in the ebook, if you hold your phone up to it, it pulls you into all the material that generated the different chapters. So if you have an ebook reader, you know, I can just show you really quick. You can do the same thing just basically by holding the phone up to the iPad or holding the iPad up to whatever device you have. And, you know, it just kind of takes that and generates the same kind of material that the musicians would be reading, and then taking that and making it become a kind of QR code that leads you into all the climate change data that generated the project. And that's the beauty of doing ebooks is you can kind of load them with lots of stuff, and that way you don't have to carry it around anymore. So,
All right.
Last question.
Thank you. Last question.
Hi.
Nicole?
Yes. It's nice to see you're offering your work for free, your content for free. Would you share how you are creating an earnings for yourself through your work?
Oh, sure. That's a great question. Very practical. There's a couple of things that go into play with free culture or open culture. Say, for example, the iTunes store. The music industry is in total free fall right now. A lot of people haven't updated their business models. So when you think about, say, for example, the publishing industry as it was done in the 20th century, where you had this sort of top-down, a small group of companies controlled all records that went out. Now that's been turned upside down, where everyone is a producer or a content provider. And the way that that influences the economics, someone like Chris Anderson over at Wired wrote a book called The Long Tail, where you look at how people look at micropayments and stuff like that. So I get a decent amount of income from my downloads, from my albums, from my giving away the app for free that generates other things. And so some economists are calling that cultural capital, which Pierre Bourdieu, for example, others are calling it a kind of a critique of what they call marginal value. There's ways that micropayments actually build up to more than you would have made. Like my last album I was on Geffen Records, for example. And that album, I have friends who are on really major labels, and they don't, these days, the major labels are just hemorrhaging money. So as an independent artist, I do, you have to travel more, and you have to DJ and do concerts live a lot more. So that makes the practical part of releasing an album. The album is almost a second thought. Like Bjork, for example, just released her album as an app called Biophilia. And a friend of mine, Scott Sneeb, designed that. And we've had more downloads with my app, but I didn't make it as a singer-songwriter engagement at all. Every song on her album is a different part of the app, whereas my app is a tool that lets people remix and sample. So they're different approaches, but I would say branding is a key component. That's why a lot of musicians are doing like everything from perfume, like they have Justin Bieber perfume, or Beyonce perfume or whatever, to on the other end of the spectrum, a lot of MCs are DJing now. You'll notice that a lot of hip hop MCs, everybody's DJing. So Q-Tip, who's a legendary MC, makes more money from DJing. But the economics of DJing are you're a one-man band. That's why I showed that Méliès piece, or one-woman symphony, whatever you want to call it. But the pun is that you have an independent production model where the tools have been democratized because of digital media, but then you have to be innovative with how you approach that business model. I mean, I'm experimental. I mean, the economics of somebody who's a mainstream techno DJ, for example, like DJ Cascade, probably nobody in this room even knows him, I bet. Maybe one or two? Okay, three. He plays like arena techno, but he gets about $250,000 for 1 hour of DJing. Wow. Yeah, and so the economics of that, if you think about arena techno, or there's other artists like David Guetta, or even will.i.am, who's an MC, but he's now DJing as well. Everybody is trying to figure out, there's an ambiguous space in the culture right now where everyone's roles are kind of shifting, and the MC role is kind of a branded space, but the DJ role is much more ambiguous, so you can do a lot of different things. For me, free culture actually has been a very useful tool, but I'm not. It's funny, there was a tour a long time ago, ancient late 90s, I'll tell you this story and then we'll end it on that. The Black Eyed Peas opened for me, and they were a breakdancing group, and I had to argue with the tour manager to get them on the tour. It was me, Redman, Everclear, and this band Soul Coughing. And Soul Coughing had a meltdown in the middle of the tour, and they had to get them off. So Black Eyed Peas came on the tour, and they weren't known back then, but they were really good breakdancers, and they would come out between the shows. So Redman, he's a big MC, but it was very funny because it was a very different approach because I was DJing. My peer group was people like DJ Shadow, DJ Crush, Cut Kimmis. I'm sure you saw the video. There was Mixmaster Mike. He's the DJ for the Beastie Boys. He's from here, actually. Or DJ Qbert. There's a whole Filipino hip-hop scene. But to make a long story short, when you start thinking about economics, the Black Eyed Peas, what their innovation was is that they were able to take the pop model. When I say model, i.e. having a very specific branded style. Whereas someone like me or Danger Mouse, I move between a lot of styles. So if you hear a DJ Spooky track, you might not be, oh yeah, but the mashup, the remix, that means that you're able to move between all the different styles. It doesn't matter because you just pick and choose at whatever direction you want to go. Whereas if somebody's an MC like Chuck D from Public Enemy is a very signature style. You won't hear him rapping over like bossa nova or something. You know, it's like. But so with that said and done, anybody else, you can feel free to drop a tweet. I'm at Twitter at DJ Spooky, or on Facebook. I'm a hardcore emailer, and I got a flight in a little bit because I got to fly back to New York. And so thank you.
Thank you. So now we know that we can talk to each other, which is great, but now let's see if we can dance together. Please follow Tracy Barlow to the dance floor.
So,